Iceland, Singapore, both islands, not the same. 1,000 years ago, a man dug a hole in the ground and made his own heated pool, using the earth. So goes the ancient saga of Snorri's pool. Icelanders have taken advantage of the Earth's natural heat for a long, long time, and it pretty much just boils down to heating water. That's no joke. It's pretty much the whole game. They use steam to turn turbines and make electricity. They pump hot water to heat here and here and here. They grow tomatoes and figs in Iceland. Nesjavellir is the most powerful geothermal well in the world and supplies 1,100 liters of scalding hot water per second. About 90% of heating and hot water for housing is geothermal. Iceland is a model, but take note, with a population of 355,620 and a total area of 39,682 square miles, Iceland's population density is only 9.1 people per square mile, one of the lowest anywhere, and a limitless heat source is right under their feet. Singapore, on the other hand, covering an area of 280 square miles, with a population of 5.5 million plus, has a staggeringly high population density at 20,212 per square mile. First for countries with a population of 1 million plus, and first among island countries. If there was ever a test of the limits of human ingenuity, efficiency goals, or renewable energy, it is here. Currently, 98% of energy is fossil fuels, although they are moving aggressively towards 25% solar PV and cutting emissions through efficiency standards and public transportation. Singapore pledged to reduce emissions by 36% from 2005 levels by 2030 and to stabilize emissions with the aim of peaking in 2030 as well. Iceland and Singapore are on opposite ends of the spectrum by population, population density, land space, region, environment, but are things really as they seem? To answer that question, we have to look deeper. Advanced. Calculating greenhouse gas emissions. Hello and welcome back. Good to have you. For this episode, we're going to look at Iceland as an example of the different ways emissions are calculated. If you want to skip ahead to the finished graph, it's summarized at the end at the time shown below. I'm going to take you through different accounting methods and their source, then recap at the end with the graph. But before I get into this, I have to talk about China. We have to talk about China because they have the most emissions in the world. That fact alone, though, isn't what I'm focused on, because China also has the most people in the world, so their emissions per capita isn't the highest when compared to other countries, such as the United States, for example. And much of the emissions produced are for manufacturing goods for export to places like the United States, as another example picked completely at random. So, as you can see, we really do have to look deeper. And the most ironic part of all of this, which is just the perfect little cherry on top of this insanity sundae, is you get to blame both capitalism and communism at the same time for the world's biggest existential crisis since the Cold War, and nuclear annihilation, for which you can also blame both capitalism and communism, but we'll have to get back to that later. Greenhouse gas emissions are measured in many different ways. You can measure the total for every country, total for the whole world, or divide the total per person in each country or against GDP or per 1,000 US dollar GDP, and that's just scratching the surface. There are also multiple accounting methods for greenhouse gas emissions, and they each tell a different story. You see, it's true what I said earlier. 90% of Iceland's heating and hot water for housing is geothermal, and renewable energy makes up most of the remaining needs. If you simply look at residential consumption, Iceland's number is negligible, irrelevant, a question of rounding in the overall total, and the myth is born. But they also have an energy-sucking aluminum and manufacturing sector, which when accounted for at a national level in a production-based method, raises Iceland's per capita emissions on par with many other developed countries, that is to say, too high. But we're not done yet. When you factor in demand for imports, foreign travel, economic influence, population, and historical data, a different perspective emerges altogether. Part of this is called a consumption-based accounting method, but even then you have to be mindful of the details. The point is, each accounting method tells a different story, and that's what ultimately led to my disillusion of how green Iceland really is. Snorri met his end in the Icelandic saga, murdered in his private tunnel which led to his pool. Iceland's low-carbon illusion has now met the same end, calculated and presented by Iceland itself. So I want to take you down the same rabbit hole and mostly pick on Iceland, but we'll look at China, Singapore, and the three Uniteds, the US, the UK, and the UAE, or United Arab Emirates. By the end, if your head doesn't explode first, you'll be in a better position to recognize the possible ways emissions data can be manipulated and hopefully just have a better overall understanding of the global crisis happening around you. Okay, so welcome, and like I said, we're going to go through focusing on Iceland, and we're going to look at some different accounting methods, and basically we're going to end up here. At the end, there's 4 different accounting methods here that each tell a different story. And this graph, this is all Iceland, so you can see there's definitely quite a bit of difference depending on how you're looking at it and what you're counting. So that's the end goal. And first I'm going to start on this Statistics Iceland webpage, and all these links are going to be in the description so you can look at them in your own time. I am just going to go over them fairly quickly. I've got highlighted here what I want to cover. So the profile for greenhouse gas emissions differs depending on the definition of the accounting behind the statistics. So that's exactly what I was just saying, and that is why we are here. This one has 2 different methods, what they call the NIR and the AEA. The AEA accounts for emissions from operations of Icelandic companies and residents of Iceland, independent of where they are located. So the resident principle is one of the key definitions of the AEA. So it's basically following the Icelanders on their, any foreign travel or economic activity. They are calculating that into the overall total. The NIR covers emissions that occur within the geographic areas under Icelandic control. The definition of geographic area includes airspace that airlines use in domestic flights and airspace up to 3,000 feet for airlines in international flights. The geographic area also includes oceanic areas used by ships that sail between ports in Iceland for all fishing vessels and 5 nautical miles for international maritime travel. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the details that they are looking at. And then these are the raw numbers down here that are plugged into this graph that they've made here. So you can see in the case of Iceland, the AEA number, which is the foreign travel, transportation, and whatever economic activity happens outside the country from residents, that definitely increases their overall total. So leaving that out kind of gives you, that's part of the low carbon illusion, which is what Iceland is actually calling it. It doesn't come from me. So that, that's just plugs into that and help creates that. I'm going to skip this part now. The LUCF, they call it land use change in forestry. That's going to come into play a little bit later. But these blue bars here and these numbers are showing less that, but we'll get into that later. So basically the conclusion here is countries, this is another element, countries which outsource the majority of transportation services and have little local industry will have AEA emissions below that of NIR. So that's just another little ripple or wrinkle in here. Foreign travel that's outsourced, so it might benefit the economy as a whole, but it's not necessarily done, or it wouldn't be in this case done by Iceland nationals. So that is another way that the numbers could be different or unaccounted. So the NIR and AEA are both considered correct numbers for greenhouse gas emissions from Iceland. The underlying questions in the two, however, are different. The NIR report is the official statistics that Iceland submits in connection with the nation's environmental commitments, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement from COP21, and that was 2015. The Kyoto Protocol was like the 90s. I don't know the exact date on the top of my head. But yeah, we're going to talk about that, these numbers being reported to the UN as well, coming up in a little bit. But to continue, we're going to look at the next accounting method, and this is the consumption-based carbon footprint. And this one is considered even more detailed than what the AEA is, the one that was just looking at foreign transportation. This one is mainly concerned with imports. So around 71% of household emissions in the world were attributed to imported goods, and the burden of emissions is highest in the developing countries. An increasing proportion of goods are not manufactured where they are used, as the bulk of the environmental impact of produced products is caused in production. Despite this, most international contracts focus on reducing pollution and emissions within the borders of each nation. The research analysis focused on Iceland, where a considerable part of the emissions stems from transport and imported products, often only revealed to a small extent in local emission measures. This results in high greenhouse gas emissions per capita in spite of the nation's domestic energy supply. The result is a low carbon illusion in which rich economies believe they are reducing their greenhouse gas responsibility while global emissions continue to grow. The study combines Icelandic household expenditure data with the so-called Eora database, and we're going to look at that later a little bit more, to calculate the consumption-based carbon footprint. The average CBCF of Icelandic households was 10.4. This is tons of CO2 equivalent per capita, similar in magnitude to EU nations despite Iceland's unique energy supply. So this is what they are calculating before this study. The Icelandic CBCF was higher than most European nations. The footprint is 55% higher than the territorial emissions inventory indicate, but the government has looked to such monitoring when aiming to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases by 40% by the year 2030. So here they're saying they are actually taking this report into account. But their emissions, we're going to look at the number, they don't actually put it in this summary. It's in the PDF, which I'm about to open, but it is 55% higher than, this is the number they're reporting to UN. The actual number from this report is 55% higher than that. So let's look at the actual report. And this is kind of the number that I want to focus on. So this is out of the University of Iceland. This is from 2017. There it is. You'll see there. And I know the numbers that I'm skipping to, so I'm just going to skip right to it. So the list of acronyms, I wanted to stop here to kind of define the Eora a little bit more. First, so what is the MRIO? So the MRIO, multi-regional input-output. So that's what they're calling this method of calculating import and greenhouse gas emissions caused by imports. And this is the name of that database. So the name of the multi-regional input-output database used in this work is named after the Aboriginal people of the Sydney Plains where the model was developed. So that is the Australian Aborigines, or at least one tribe in the Sydney area. I just thought that was interesting, so wanted to point that out. I actually did a video on the Australian Aborigines in the History of Reality 101 series. It's part 2. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Wanted to point that out. Now I'm going to skip to whatever section this is. Section 1 in the introduction. So they're kind of making the case for why Iceland is a good example. To date, no in-depth carbon footprint analysis of any kind has been completed. That includes Iceland. Iceland presents an interesting case for analysis for a number of reasons. One, the supply of electricity and heating is almost entirely decarbonized, which I covered earlier, because of their geothermal and hydrological resources. Number 2, there is a high standard of living and material goods consumption. So also that another layer of that is there an island. So a lot of this that causes an increase in imports, which adds to greenhouse gas emissions. Number 3, there is a strong reliance on imports for almost all durable goods and most food products. And that's kind of why when you use this method, their footprint becomes quite a bit higher. Now I want to spend a little bit of time on their definition of the consumption-based carbon footprinting. So in cases where considerable emissions are embodied in trade, the CB accounting perspective can be extremely useful. They attribute all greenhouse gas emissions to the final consumer, who ultimately drives demand for natural resource extraction and supply. However, this is complicated in practice. Both consumer and producer have a degree of responsibility and control over emissions embodied in purchases, which has resulted in various models of split responsibility. The total amount of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions emitted by humanity into the Earth's atmosphere each year is the same, regardless of whether CB or PB, that's consumption-based or production-based perspective, is taken. If every nation's production and consumption-based was added together by nation, the result of the two sums would be the same. The difference is in the allocation of global emissions to each nation. So hopefully you all understand that. The total emissions is the same regardless of which method you use. It's just allocating responsibility depending on mainly demand or supply. So that is essentially the difference between consumption-based, production-based. So always be aware of that. And let's see, next page, we're going to get into the actual numbers. This is section 4, results. So this is the results of the report, the research. And what they found, like I said earlier, 55% larger. What that number is 22.5 tons CO2 equivalent per capita. And just in case you don't know, whenever it says CO2 equivalent, they are calculating the whole greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm going to get to what that includes in a second here. But then they are taking the total greenhouse gas emissions and making that an equivalent to what a CO2 would be, CO2 emissions would be, and then they are. That's just to get one total number for everything, so you don't have to look at all the different the emissions for each gas individually. So they're lumping them all together, equivalent to whatever the CO2 would be. So hopefully that makes sense. Just keep that number in mind, 22.5. That is in contrast to what they report to the UN, which is 10 point whatever it was, 10.2. And we'll look at that again at the end. I should also point out this first page here, these numbers, this is CO2 only. So this is just carbon dioxide, it's not accounting for other greenhouse gases. Okay, so this is on Wikipedia, but the source for the information here is the EDGAR database, created by the European Commission and Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. These are 2018 numbers, and this EDGAR database is what the EU reports, and it has for all world countries, and it's what is reported to the UN. And I covered that in the first video, Rapa Nui and Anuta. So if you want to go into more detail there, you can check that video out, and as always, these links are in the description. But this is the graph here, and as you can see, it has the total CO2 emissions worldwide, also international aviation and shipping, and then it has the per capita over here. So I wanted to sort this by the most overall, and as you can see, China is number 1, which I pointed out earlier. United States is number 2, European Union number 3, India and Russia round out the top 5. But if you look over here on the per capita basis, just because you have the most emissions does not mean the per person responsibility is the same. So out of the top 5, you can see the United States is easily number 1 overall per capita. And I don't think that comes as a surprise. But just be aware of how certain groups will manipulate the data. This, I would say, is the more important factor, especially when you start adding in these other accounting methods, like how many of the United States, how much emissions can be attributed to United States imports that would add on top of this and be taken away even from the China number. I mean, it's already almost half. So I'd be interested to see what those studies, and the point of this is to show, in the case of Iceland especially, that raises the number by quite a bit. So now I'm going to get into a little more detail on the EDGAR database. This is not the Eora that I talked about at the beginning. This is the EDGAR. So this is not calculating based on imports or foreign travel. So the emissions database provides global past and present data, present day anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollutants by country and on a spatial grid. Like I said earlier, it's a joint project between the European Commission and the Netherlands. So here's the difference between CO2 and CO2 equivalent. So whenever it says CO2 equivalent, these are the emissions calculated. And I'm not going to go through all these, but this is the list. So if you're interested in knowing what goes into that, here it is. And this is on the, I believe, yeah, under the EDGAR tab. And this is the European Commission website. This is the methodology tab, sorry. Okay, so briefly what they are considering: spatial allocation, that is a 0.1 by 0.1 degree grid cells. Geographical database was built using spatial proxy datasets with location of energy and manufacturing facilities, road networks, shipping routes, human and animal population density, and agricultural land use that vary over time. So it is a geographical, basically it's a national accounting method. And that's what I was talking about with the NIR earlier. Number 4, availability of annual and monthly sector-specific emissions time series from 1970 onwards. So this is a pretty extensive database. And this is the actual page where the report is available. Like I said, it's also available on Wikipedia. It's the same information. They just have a little more available in this right here. You can see in this table anyway. So this is a little more extensive than what's on Wikipedia. And I shouldn't say a little, it's a lot. So you can see you can switch from CO2 total emissions to all greenhouse gas emissions. Over here, you can do it by per capita, per GDP. So there's just a lot available, and there's many different ways to look at it. So let's do a greenhouse gas per capita. And yeah, you can also see there's it only goes to 2015 on the total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a little lagging. The information's lagging a bit. Let's see. But who did I say I was going to look at closer? Let's see. It was the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, and the United Kingdom, China, Singapore, and Iceland. So let's see how do they all stack up. So you have the United Arab Emirates are going to be pretty high on the list. They are a heavy oil-based economy. They have a 26.94 total. They are above the United States by 6. United States is at 20. New Zealand pretty high on the list. That's kind of surprising. Russia down at 15. Here's Iceland at 1507. So not, like I said, that's the low carbon illusion they call it. Where is Singapore? All the way down here at 10.54. So even with all the modernization, they're still low on the list. But below them, surprise, surprise, China, 9.35. The scary thing is that this per capita number is growing and will continue to grow. And if it were to get up to the level of like the United States or the UAE, I mean, it's lights out at that point. United Kingdom last, or lowest. I shouldn't say last. So they come out the winner of the handful that I picked. They come in the lowest, 8.56, just below China at 9.35. So probably not too much of a surprise, the UAE, the top. And I think this is probably the best that we have right now, the best method or overall for all world countries. But still not the most detailed, and probably doesn't give you the best picture. But as far as what's available worldwide, I think that's your best bet. So this is that same report, or this is the updated report. I went over this same report in the first video, but it was the 2018 version, I believe. But the 2019 has now added the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a little more detailed. And I just wanted to look at these three Uniteds. If I can get down to the end here. Well, they're focusing a lot on the United States, aren't they? I think I picked the wrong one. There we go. Here's the United's page. So we have United Kingdom, United Arab Emirates. Okay, so if we look at United Arab Emirates, as I just pointed out, theirs is the highest from the handful of countries that I picked out, higher than the US, higher than China, higher than the UK. Overall, it looks like it's going down. That's probably because of population, I would assume. Because the total emissions are growing year by year. CO2 making up the bulk. And just industrial combustion overall on the rise. United Kingdom kind of tells the opposite story, but hopefully, as a developed nation, they have nowhere to go but down. At least that's the hope. We are going to look at this at the end. Most of the European nations, their emissions have peaked, which is a good sign. So hopefully these numbers continue to drop. The United States has somewhat flatlined, but overall it's still up in the air. I know the numbers are growing in the last couple years, and we all know why that is. Moving on, this is coming out of the Phillip research series, and it is just looking at overall renewable targets, policies. They say by country, but it's kind of limited. So I'll just go right into the report. So this is the overall summary report here from May 2017. And you can see it does cover, I guess the main ones, U.S. and China, and a few more populated areas as well, but it does leave out the European Union, so can't really compare. But the reason I pulled it up is I was looking for information on Singapore, since that was the other example I used in this video. So let's look at them because they are also an interesting case. Small island, lots of people, and they outline that here. So Singapore is different to all other countries we have reported about so far, and the measures is taking to combat climate change are subsequently also very different. The combination of extremely limited resource availability and a dense island population mean the cleaning up the energy mix and reducing carbon emissions is a real challenge for Singapore. It has no fossil fuel resources and very little opportunity to use renewables, but emissions reducing measures do need to be implemented as it is host to several emission intensive industries like petroleum refineries and aviation. And the aviation is actually going to be a main one they're going to have to focus on because tourism is becoming bigger more and more there. Singapore is making the best of its situation by focusing on energy efficiency and becoming a hub for technology and research in alternative energy. So as I said earlier, they have committed to, well, this is their 2020 goal, 16% below business as usual by 2020, 36 below 2005 levels by 2030, and they plan to peak by then. They have a 4-part plan to meet these emissions called the Climate Action Plan, which is, that's what everybody calls their plan, Climate Action Plan. Let's see, and unfortunately, the conclusion of this report is the Climate Action Tracker has concluded Singapore's efforts in limiting global warming to 2 degrees. Remember, I talked about the publicized goal is typically 1.5. Well, they're trying to change it to 2, which they do in this report. But even to meet that 2-degree goal, their efforts are inadequate and its targets are weak. Pretty blunt. They state that with the current policies in place, Singapore's emissions by 2030 will be a 123% increase on 1994 levels, and given Singapore's economic capabilities, they could really stretch their targets. Singapore is one of the world's biggest hubs for aviation and navigation, and this is an enormous source of emissions, more than 3 times Singapore's domestic emissions. So, yeah, depending on accounting methods that you used, Singapore's emissions could be, well, they would be very much affected by the aviation numbers. So if you took a AEA emissions approach, for example, which is, remember from the beginning, the one that calculates foreign travel based on citizens, and I can almost guarantee you without looking at the data, most of Singapore's aviation is going to be from foreigners. So depending on how you calculate those, you can either attribute those to Singapore, which in some ways is fair because they are, attracting the tourism and the travel and all of that. But you could also blame that on the source, or point to the source and calculate it that way. So again, the whole point of this is just to be aware of the different ways the data can be manipulated. Despite all this, Singapore's plans for action against climate change are practical. Given their limited resource availability, there was no alternative energy industry in Singapore prior to 2007, but by 2015, 100 clean energy companies have moved there. So they're trying to end it on a somewhat positive light. They have information here that you can look at. So their solar PV is growing. This cuts off at 2015. But as you can see, natural gas has made up the majority of their energy increases. This little other here, despite the growth, still only accounts for 3% of the overall profile. So that is where Singapore is. Their supply of renewable is growing, but it is being outpaced by demand and by natural gas. Sticking with Singapore, this is a release from SimCore, and this was just a couple weeks ago, April 13th. They have announced the first renewable energy certificate aggregator platform to meet the sustainable needs of customers. These renewable energy certificates manage energy from multiple sources. The platform aggregates RECs by combining them from different sources generated from SimCore renewable assets for sale in bulk. This is especially useful for RE100 companies looking to purchase large volumes of RECs to offset their carbon footprint. So this is basically taking energy produced that's being fed into the grid, turning them into certificates and selling those over this marketplace. And theoretically it's a way to increase demand, and it just also gives suppliers a way to make more money. The use of blockchain technology from the SimCore REC aggregator platform ensures transparency and integrity of every transaction, as well as a better security. So they're using blockchain technology that's going to be similar to like Bitcoin. This has a few statements at the bottom here. This is from UBS Singapore, UBS Bank. Globally, UBS met our sustainability targets a year ahead of schedule, with our core sustainable investments rising to $488 billion and cutting our carbon-related assets by more than 40%. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's not insignificant. Let's say that. This guy bragging about installing or planning to install 21,000 solar panels atop 6 industrial properties to avoid 4.3 million kilograms of CO2. Carbon emissions annually. And this is a guy looking forward to selling his RECs from the solar power generation on his rooftop. And then last, I thought this was interesting. For instance, SimCore is able to package traditional power with green power through physical assets and RECs to optimally balance the energy and sustainable requirements of each customer. So, yeah, I didn't look at that any closer than just this statement, but it sounds like they're combining fossil fuel power with renewable energy into these wrecks. So I don't know, that sounds kind of iffy to me. Like, there seems like there's some room for fudging the numbers a little bit there, but I don't know. I'll reserve judgment for now. Alright, so let's recap what we covered. And again, this is using Iceland as an example. So if you look up here, these are the years, and this is off, so this first one's off the EDGAR for 2017. And remember, the EDGAR is basically equivalent to the NIR, so that is the national production-based. This is for 2017. Oh wow, how did this get in there? So this population, there, the population for Iceland in 2017, 338,000. So for each year I have the population down here. But the NIR or EDGAR production-based method nationally by Iceland's geography came to 12.2, and that is tons of CO2 per capita per year. And that is only CO2, so fossil CO2 emissions, you can see right here. This next number from 2016, so a year earlier, and keep in mind the population is changing a little bit, so you know, their population is growing slowly. These, as you go to the right here, it's getting older, so this is 2011. I use the 2011 number here. I'll explain that in a minute. But for the AEA, remember that's foreign transportation for 2016. That is 16.9. So even with a lower population, we have a higher overall emissions, and this is again CO2, not all greenhouse gas emissions. The total greenhouse gas emissions, the latest number that we have is from 2015, so again the population is just a little bit lower, not enough to make a huge difference, I don't think. But that number for the total greenhouse gas emissions is actually lower than the foreign transportation number at 15, about 15 even. So imagine if you added all greenhouse gas emissions to the foreign transportation number. You know, you can see your number would be even higher than is what's shown here. And this last example, the national consumption-based carbon footprint plus imports, 22.5, and this is greenhouse gas emissions total, so it's the tons of CO2 equivalent per capita. Now their study was an average of 2010 through 2012, so that's why I used the 2011 population number. So again, the population number is lower. Emissions overall total per capita is higher. And I mean, to me it's pretty clear, and that was the overall conclusion of the study, is that this impacts more first world countries, so developed countries. It raises the carbon emissions responsibility of developed nations, lowers it for developing nations, because that is what this number is mostly reflecting, as well as the foreign transportation number. So depending on the accounting method, the data can be manipulated to shift the responsibility from country to country. And I think the overall the countries that benefit the most from this are the developed countries, I think, especially the ones who are most responsible historically, which is obviously going to be the United States and the European nations. And that's where we are. So just be mindful of that. Be mindful of the acronyms. Be mindful of where they're sourcing their information. Because it's a mess. The whole thing is just a mess, and it can be easily confused. And I think part of that, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say that's the goal of, I don't think they complicated it on purpose, but it has definitely become that. So, just another wrinkle that you have to be aware of. So anyway, hopefully this helps. And then lastly, I do want to end on somewhat of a positive note here. This is from the World Economic Forum. 11 EU states have already met their 2020 renewable energy targets. This was from February 18th, 2019. Almost half EU's 28 members have already hit or are close to hitting their 2020 renewable energy targets. And this little graphic here shows which ones have and which ones haven't. So the green dot is the target. Sweden over here outperforming everybody. EU total not quite there. Bringing up the rear is the Netherlands, which is kind of funny since they're one of the main partners that are calculating emissions. They're furthest from their goal, a little over 7 percentage points away. France is next, followed by Ireland and the UK. So even though the UK was the least emissions of the examples I was looking at earlier, they are still about 5 percentage points away from their overall goal. Last year, meaning 2018, global investment in renewables like wind and solar, along with energy tech such as smart meters, topped $332 billion. But that was a decrease of 8% on the previous year. The biggest player in the clean energy sector for 2018 was China, which invested around $100 billion, a 32% drop in the 2017 figure. This was also a 53% decline in China's ongoing investment in solar power. So I guess the overall conclusion here is one, Iceland has done a good job in providing information and making distinctions between different accounting methods. Much better than the rest of the world, I would say. Also, China gets a bad rap. Even though they have the most emissions in the world, they are also doing the most about it, or investing the most. Well, you can say a lot for their pollution in their country. Obviously, they have a lot of work to go, a lot of improvements to make, but they shouldn't be the only focus. Probably shouldn't even be the biggest focus. That, I think, obviously, is the United States. So, the main conclusion here, which is exactly what, so at the end of the first video, I read a quote from Bill Gates, and in his opinion, there is no climate plan without the U.S., and I agree. I think the U.S. has to join. Right now we're not, obviously. but there is no climate plan without the U.S. That should be the takeaway. So, all right, thanks for joining me. That's the end of part 2. Part 3, I don't know what it is off the top of my head. Let me actually look at my cheat sheet here. Part 3 is Hawaii and Taiwan. So be sure to tune in for that. I don't know what the other section is going to be on that one. But we're going to be back with Hawaii and Taiwan for part 3. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all later. Bye now.